When you picture a powerful queen from the ancient world, what comes to mind? Probably someone shimmering with gold, right? Celebrated in poetry, radiating this almost divine status. And the Hellenistic queen, she's the poster child for this ideal. But what if I told you that whole brilliant image was basically a carefully constructed illusion? One designed not to celebrate her power, but to control it. I mean, listen to this. This is a court poet describing Queen Berenike I of Egypt. She's not just a queen. She is the earthly double of Aphrodite, the goddess of love. The message couldn't be clearer. She's the most beautiful, the most desirable, basically the perfect trophy for a king. Now that's a stunning tribute, isn't it? It sounds like she's at the absolute pinnacle of power. But is it really that simple? And that right there brings us to the big question of this whole explainer. Was this glittering public image a sign of her power, or was it really a sign of his? Was it a true reflection of her authority, or was this entire persona engineered to serve a completely different purpose, one that had everything to do with the man wearing the crown? Okay, this is where things get really fascinating. There's this powerful theory out there from historian Sheila Ager that suggests this entire public image, it wasn't really about the queen at all. Nope. It was a strategic move in a super high-stakes status game played by kings. So what was this game all about? Well, you have to imagine the world these guys lived in. It was hyper-competitive. All these Hellenistic kings were jockeying for position, trying to be the true successor to Alexander the Great. Every single advantage mattered. And you know what one of the most visible ways a king could show off his success was? The woman standing next to him. Her value, in the public's eye, reflected directly on him. And this was no accident. It was basically policy, and it was driven by some really deep-seated psychology. First up, there's a concept called precarious manhood. The best way to think about it is like a modern CEO who feels like he has to have the fancy car and the private jet to prove he's on top. For these ancient warrior kings, masculinity wasn't a given. It was a fragile social status that you had to constantly perform and publicly defend. Losing one battle, showing one moment of weakness, it could shatter the whole image. And this is exactly where the queen becomes a key player in the game. It's something called the radiating effect. Psychological studies have actually shown this is a real thing. We tend to think more highly of someone if their partner is really attractive. So for a king, getting the most beautiful, most desirable woman was a public slam dunk. It was a declaration of his own top-tier status. He was, quite literally, basking in her reflected glory, and it boosted his own fragile manhood in the eyes of all his rivals. But here's the twist. This whole Aphrodite queen model, it wasn't the only option on the table, not by a long shot. In fact, Greek history was chock full of different and often much more tangible models of female power. The Hellenistic kings were making a very, very deliberate choice to promote this one kind of queen over all the others. And when you put them side by side, the contrast is just stark. The Hellenistic model basically shrinks a queen's role down to being a beautiful wife and mother. Her value is all tied up in producing heirs. But other Greek women, they held roles with real, independent authority. They were political regents, powerful priestesses, and major economic players in their own right. Just take a look at the women of Sparta. While the men were off fighting all the time, the women were pretty much running the show back home. The philosopher Aristotle was so blown away by it, he actually wrote about it. Spartan women owned a staggering 40% of all the land. That's not just influence, my friends. That is cold, hard economic power. And if you go back even further, way back to the Bronze Age, you find the Wanasa. We've found inscribed tablets that show she wasn't just a sidekick, she was a power player. She was managing huge estates, running vital religious ceremonies, and the stuff she was buried with shows she had a status that could easily rival any king's. But these examples of real, independent female authority, well, that's exactly what these new Hellenistic kings were afraid of. Because history had also produced a very different kind of woman, a woman who could command armies, orchestrate assassinations, and seize power for herself. Meet Olympias, mother of Alexander the Great. She was brilliant, incredibly ambitious, and just utterly ruthless. She waged her own wars, executed her rivals, and was widely suspected of having her own husband murdered. She was, for all intents and purposes, the boogeyman for every Hellenistic king, the ultimate nightmare of what could happen if you let a royal woman have too much real power. So, to prevent another Olympias from ever taking the stage, these new dynasties engineered a complete rebranding of what it even meant to be a queen. They gave her what you could call an Aphrodite makeover, transforming her public image from a potential political threat into a divine object of desire. And right here, we get to the absolute heart of it. That beautiful, romantic image of the queen, it wasn't a celebration of her power at all. It was a cage. A gilded one, maybe, but a cage nonetheless, designed to keep her safely and squarely in her place. So, how'd they build this cage? Well, there were three key steps. First, they relentlessly emphasized her beauty, always linking her to Aphrodite. And notice the goddess they chose. Never Athena, the goddess of wisdom and war, or Artemis, the fiercely independent hunter. The branding was very deliberate. Second, they celebrated her fertility, making motherhood her most important political function. And third, they pushed this idea of spousal love, making sure her entire public identity was defined by how devoted she was to her husband. So where does all of this leave us? It brings us to what I think is the most important takeaway from this whole thing: the absolutely critical difference between public prominence and actual power. They are not the same thing, not even close. Look, a Hellenistic queen might get her face on a coin. She'd have statues raised in her honor. She might even be worshipped in a state cult. That's fame. That's being prominent. But real power? That's controlling your own money. It's influencing policy. It's having political factions that are loyal to you. It's being able to act on your own, even against the king's will. And by that measure, these Aphrodite queens had very, very little. It all boils down to this incredibly powerful summary from Sheila Agar. That dazzling public image we see wasn't a reflection of the queen's own authority. It was a projection of the king's ambition and his control. It was not queen's power, but king's will. And that leaves us with a question that echoes all the way from their world straight into ours. The next time you see a prominent woman being celebrated in the public eye for her beauty, her fashion, her role as a partner, it's worth stopping for a second to ask, whose story is that image really telling? Is it hers, or is it someone else's?